range of strength certification, lesson 1, we look at static bodyweight stretches. So the static bodyweight stretches, static stretching in general, is really the foundation of where we start when we think about introducing flexibility. If we think about kind of the foundation of flexibility work, it comes from these lower level tiers, which we categorize as most of it in static stretching. And now that you've maybe gone through the cert, or you've started the cert, or you've come to range of strength certification, it's because you've found that there's really almost like a roof over static stretching. Like there's no beyond that. It's like static stretching is flexibility, and this is what flexibility is. And this is what we're really trying to do with the range of strength certification, is break that roof. We're trying to like take the roof down and show where those next tiers are when it comes to flexibility. So our objectives will be to review and define the purpose of static bodyweight stretching. And it is important to know that I'm saying static bodyweight stretching. I'm not saying static stretching. So for the purpose of range of strength certification, we focus on the static bodyweight stretching. And I'm going to get a little more into that and define the purpose of that. We are going to learn to program and apply static bodyweight stretches. So we're going to review that. I'm just going to put my do not disturb on so that there's no weird noises coming up. So we are going to review those concepts of programming and applying these stretches, the when, the why, and the how, and hopefully create some course discussion around that. And then we're going to do a little practical activity, a little application of static bodyweight stretches, kind of just get into the nitty gritty of it. So redefining passive. This is the biggest takeaway from this lesson, is we are, with range of strength course learning and certification, redefining that term passive, because there's more to it than that. And a lot of the recent research is showing that it's not a passive stretch when done a certain way in some of these certain positions, specifically when it comes to static stretching, which is the most researched component of flexibility training. So previously, static passive flexibility has been defined as the ability to assume and maintain extended positions using body weight or using the strength of another limb not coming from the stretched limb. So the last portion there of this paragraph makes the most sense when we think of passive flexibility. So if I were to use my arm to hold my leg, stretch my hamstring, I would be very much moving in like a passive range and not necessarily loading the hamstring as much. And or if someone else did that for me, like if a partner lifted my arm for me, okay, I wouldn't be putting my the muscles under load and tension. It would just be done for me. But when we use our own body weight to load a stretch, it's not passive, but rather isometric on the muscles at length. So when the body weight gets moved into a position where it is going to lengthen muscle tissue and tendons, we are going to load and put an isometric tension on our muscles. And this is the importance of this lesson. We are discussing static bodyweight stretching as a key component to the range of strength system. And this would be, static bodyweight stretching is a trainable component of flexibility, whereas Someone just like lifting my limb to show the range that it has wouldn't be a trainable component unless it was like PNF specific. But what we're doing with this lesson is really diving deeper into the content of body weight static stretching and how we can use our own body weight to load muscle and create more strength in a stretch. When we do it this way, it becomes strength training, really, at the end of the day. And that's, again, comes back to that whole concept of range of strength. We're actually building strength in a quote unquote passive stretch. It's not a passive stretch. It's actually a loaded stretch, but it's loaded at a different tier. And that's the nice thing about static body weight stretches. We can control them and tier them so much, and that we can really focus on below threshold work and progressively build up to threshold work. Okay, so that's a very important thing to think about here. Is this is why we categorize it at like a beginner level, because we can really hone in on being below a threshold with someone who may be particularly limited, not just in their own flexibility, but maybe if they are currently injured or in a state of rebuild where they're rebuilding new tissue. The focus is to be below a threshold and build to a threshold. So this allows us to progressively have those stepping stones where we get to weighted mobility and higher intensity isometric work. So that's the key takeaway from this lesson, is how we are redefining passive, because it's not passive when we do body weight static stretching. So let's talk about the purpose of the body weight static stretching. For one, at its lowest tier, it's decreasing resting tension. So we suffer from it in that we may be inactive. So we have this resting tension being, I'm sitting in this chair right now, my muscles are tense, and they need to breathe. They need to be lengthened and moved out into a greater range. We also have resting tension because we maybe are training hard at a high level. So in order for us to be able to recover faster, engage in systems of the body that will allow us to recover faster, we need to find ways to decrease resting tension. And in that, it increases recovery. So there's a lot of that old school research, which is still current, that in performing a static stretch style sequence, when done properly, we're removing lactic acid from the muscles, and we can recover quickly or have better recovery from high intensity sessions. So because we're able to work and control that threshold, so we can work below a threshold, we can channel in on parasympathetic nervous systems. There's really no other training modality that does that. I would argue that this is probably why yoga is so popular, because people get to channel in on the recovery nervous system. Our nervous systems are always jacked up. Central nervous system is always highest adrenaline, stressors from work, stressors from training. It's not a practice that we really integrate. It's something that we really have to search for. Like, how can I channel in my inner relaxation? So static body weight stretching, because we're able to work below a threshold, we do want to work towards threshold, but because we're able to work below it, it does allow us to channel in that parasympathetic nervous system and that recovery system, relaxation, meditative kind of flow state, so to speak. When done correctly, we are eccentrically lengthening at an end range. This is a very key thing for someone who can't get into positions. So if you're working with someone who can't squat ass to grass, if we can find ways to get them into end range knee flexion through static bodyweight stretches or end range dorsiflexion, external rotation of the hip and internal rotation of the hip, we now can find ways to eccentrically lengthen end ranges that they can't get into with big positions. So this would be like, this is when you can make those connections, you're gonna produce the results that people are looking for. Because I mean, the common state of affairs for individuals that can't get into positions is they just think that they just can't do that. So I can't ask to grass squat. I'm not going to ask to grass squat. You got to learn to eccentrically lengthen a lot of these positions and limb lengths to build tissue there while working towards that end state, that ask to grass squat. And in that, we lay down new tissue. So if someone can't eccentrically lengthen through an end range of knee flexion, for example, they can't lay down tissue in that end range. So they're never necessarily going to get there until we can produce that low threshold position and build them up to a threshold. So this is like a very key component for us with the static bodyweight stretching, is like we're actually strength training. We're strength training, and we're doing these basic, what people think are basic stretching, but we're doing them with a different intent and a different means of getting someone to a higher state. So when done correctly, that an intro level bodyweight static stretching approach is a strength training component for people who are poor movers or need to rebuild tissue in areas that maybe were previously injured, coming out of injury or rehab. Again, if you go back to some of our lessons from range support, where we had Dr. Brandon Kallman talking about imbalances in range, he's openly sharing his experiences in a clinical setting where it's just getting someone to a certain operating state, which isn't the operating state that's going to get them to that performance level that's ideal. And then they leave the clinic, right? So then these people, they leave and they're actually not at a level that's going to get them able-bodied, moving and doing things that they should be able to do. It's just like they've gotten to a certain percentage of strength and then they're good to go kind of thing. So we can help these people and or people that are just, pre-injury really make the core changes that they need to make in their lives with static bodyweight stretching. It's the gateway into like real strength. So let's talk about programming. So in range of strength, we have categorized static bodyweight stretches under preparatory range. It is important for us to have these categories so that we know where we're going. And preparatory range means we got to lay down the groundwork if we're going to get to this point. And it's a great way to do it because you can give yourself as a coach and the people you work with the vision of what they're working towards. So this is preparatory front split range work. Yes, we are just working on stretching the quads and hips and ankles and hamstrings, but it's preparatory to a greater position and to a greater milestone and to a greater target. I would argue that if I am doing a kettlebell goblet squat with someone and telling them this is a means to an end because we are going to work towards an Olympic high bar squat and you're going to get super strong and mobile, it's the same ideology. It's the same thought process, but we're applying it to flexibility and we get way more buy-in when we do it that way. So that's where we categorize the static body weight stretches under preparatory range. As you go through the course learnings, you see that. As you go deeper into range of strength protocols, you'll be able to define that in your own way and what that means to you and the people you're working with and yourself. And for programming, this is like if we read a case study. So at the final exam for range of strength, it's case study based. We present a couple different avatars and scenarios, and we're getting you to think about how you're going to approach that person. I mean, this scenario where we would be thinking a lot about static body weight stretching being like the core of the programming, it would be with beginners. So someone comes to you and they're really limited in their movement, and maybe not even that they can't, I mean, it's not even sometimes that they aren't flexible. It's just that they can't access these ranges because they don't know how, and they don't know the proper application, which is what we see a lot in the range sprint. With the proper application of certain positions, people already do have access to a lot of ranges that they didn't know they had access to. But this would be most important for beginners. We would really, when we evaluate a person, we're like, man, this person really is at a low level of understanding their own body and what it means to stretch or strength train or anything. It's like we're really going to be focusing on the body weight static stretches. So we've talked about it being really a good place for bodyweight static stretches as also being really good for the warm-ups if we were planning to be more specific to a deep range session. So if I was going to be building a session to a greater range, so if it was a side split, front split, back bridge session, like we're going to be progressively working towards that greater outer range position, that big milestone expression of range, then in that setting, the preparatory range work would be a good warm-up, a great warm-up. And there's a lot of controversy in stretching in warm-ups. Static, like we had Dan Van Zant on, and he did a great presentation of some of the research behind that and how it's not necessarily accurate and it's really skewed research. But still within a warm-up, we're not going to stretch super hard and super crazy. But if the session is directed towards going deeper into a greater range or an outer range position, like some of those big milestones, then this would be like the best and most specific warm-up that you could do. Thinking about recovering between sessions. So again, coming back to that recovery system in the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and recover. So in order for us to optimize our recovery and recover our best, it is recommended that we spend time moving through greater range positions, but at a low threshold. So body weight static stretching is the number one thing you can do to recover between sessions when it's implemented properly. So this is, again, the science shows that it's the best thing to do, but it's not prescribed or implemented probably the best. It's usually like a very secondary kind of like just stretch between your workouts and you'll recover better, but no one really does it because no one actually prescribes it and gives like specifics around how you should do it. It's just that do some yoga or just stretch your ankles or something. Like it's very, very non-specific. And then when we do think about what we're doing at the end of a session, we can reduce the production of lactic acid by doing static stretching at the end of a session. So like a lot of research has proven that the static stretching works really well at removing lactic acid at the end of a high intensity conditioning fatigued session. But again, that has to be executed properly. I would argue that the way people do cool down with stretches isn't the way that I would recommend doing it. and it's not necessarily executed to an extent that we like to think about executing it with the range of strength content that we're learning. So a good way to think about the static bodyweight stretches is that there is a higher tolerance of frequency with proper threshold being prescribed. So we can think about prescribing it more regularly, but we would have to regulate that threshold level. So it may be, for example, I'll give you the couch stretch as an example, that we do want someone to improve their knee flexion and through that end range and build strength and lay down new tissue. But I'm not going to prescribe them hard threshold work all the time. So threshold also has to be examined. You have to like find that threshold for that person with proper alignment. At what point are they in the stretch where they feel like they're still below threshold? So you may have to push them to find that point where they're like, that's too far, and then get them to back off a little bit. And then that would be probably where we could prescribe a higher frequency at that level where they feel like they're below. But I talked about this again, I think last week with standards, that we still want them to be pushing into that threshold. It's just like strength training. If we don't progressively overload, we won't get there. There won't be that end state that we're looking for. But higher tolerance to high frequency, we would be looking to be below that threshold. So prescription, how do we prescribe it? So this would be Dr. Helen Langevin. Her research has really changed the scope of static stretching. So a lot of what has come out of the FRC methodology of flexibility and stretching has come from a lot of her research, and a lot of the ways that we think now and approach the static stretches. A lot of it does come from her research. This link here I can share after. I guess I can just post it in the comments or of the range support, but I will attach that link to the course as well, because it is just a really nice interview with her where she just describes her research in a really clear way, where you don't have to, I guess, filter through hundreds of pages of research to really find what she's getting at. But what a lot of her research got to and proved was that when we are holding a stretch, there's more happening at a cellular level than we think. So when a stretch is held for a certain prescribed amount of time, you can access the fibroblast cells more. And if we access those cells, we're accessing the healing properties and restructuring properties of the cells, which is what we want to do with parts of the body that are limited, and it's limited because it hasn't moved in that position and there's no tissue strength or anything built around that area. So a lot of how I prescribe it now, and a lot of how some of the other components or brands, I guess, of flexibility are prescribing static stretching now, comes a lot from this backed research findings. The prescription itself, we're trying to get into a zone where we are building connective tissue regeneration and repair. That's the goal, and we're fine. And it was previously thought that a stretch wouldn't do that. We needed to do 10 other things. But if the stretch is done and prescribed in such a way, the stretch itself does all the things that we're looking for. So then we don't have to be wrapping bands around squat racks and ankles and shoulders and doing 30 reps of this and 80 reps of that. We just need to do the stretch, and we need to do it properly and with the prescribed amount of time, and it will do those things that we're looking for it to do. We need to be patient. So the 2 to 3 minute work window has been researched and found to be the most successful work window for a static stretch for a prescribed amount of time. And what I want you to think about, though, with that is the many ways that you could prescribe that. So let's just say that 2 to 3 minutes is the best work window, like straight time to access those cells. It still can be broken down, especially when we are working with new people who are not receptive to flexibility training. It's going to take some time for them to get comfortable and used to the modalities of it and the comfort levels of it, the thresholds that I'm talking about. There's many ways that we can prescribe that work window. So a 30-second work window is 4 to 5 sets. So 30 seconds. So if we're doing a couch stretch, we alternate back and forth on each leg 4 to 5 times. We've obtained a work window that is effective. 60-second work windows can work well in 2 to 3 sets. And then that 2 to 3 minute work window works well within 1 set. So we can get that, access those cells that we're looking to access and get those healing properties and restructuring properties that we're looking for. And I've even done, and you've seen it in the range sprint and some of the other protocols, a lower work window. But that is when we are getting into greater intensities. So that's something that we can talk about later on, is like when we do start getting into outer range work combined with loaded range work, there's just like different thought processes that you should consider there. And it is a bit of a trial and error sort of thing when you are trying different things. But this is a really nice template to follow when we think about the most effective work window. So 5 minutes max seems to be that point where we start to see diminishing returns. So research has shown this, and a lot of practitioners have shown that, have like taken on case studies and tried to find, where that window is. Kit Laughlin was one of them as well too. That he really honed in on that diminishing return window. Like he played around a lot with where it seemed to be too much. And that was kind of that point. So around that 5 minute mark was where there just seemed to be like nothing really happening, and the body, starts to move either into being at risk, like the threshold is kind of starting to get too far, or there's no return in investment there. So there's no value in holding it longer than that. But the 2 to 3 minute window being what is the least amount of work that I need to do to get it done in the best way. And that's the hot spot. That's where we want to be. So for today's practical application, I want to look at the 3 bodyweight static stretches that are the standards in the course. So these are the 3 that we look at that we want all coaches and individuals that are going through the course to be able to execute at the top tier and understand in fully the progressions and regressions and all of that stuff. And if we want to dive further into bodyweight static stretches, we can now refer to that range of strength exercise library. That it's in range of strength protocols, but I've also attached it to the range of strength certification if that's where you're doing your core learning. It's just a template that has all of the preparatory static bodyweight stretches, agonist activations, the loaded range work, like all of the exercises are there. There's like 100 exercises there. So you can get like ideas because there's just so many variations of it, but these are the 3 core ones that we want to look at for standard certification. So I would like to do some troubleshooting on these 3 stretches today. And I'm just going to stop my screen share here. And look, you guys are still here. Sweet. I closed all the face windows when I was talking, and I was kind of like, wonder if I can close this and you guys will be gone. There'll be no practical application. But I would like to start with the pike stretch. And what I'll do is maybe if Riley, if you don't mind being a demo, we could get you to perform a pike stretch, and we'll discuss some of those fine points. So, yeah. He also looks the most set up to have the space to do these, so he might do all of them. But it should create some good discussion for us.
Righto. Yes.
So this is good. He's jumping on. He's going to do the seated pike stretch.
Yeah. So you're talking more in this position?
So this is good. It's good that he... Yeah, it's good that he's in that position, because that creates that discussion of, so if we're doing a bodyweight static stretch and we're trying to load the stretch, how would we progress this, and what's probably the best one to load the stretch? Like, what's the best position?
To start loading this position will be pushing from the back.
Yeah.
Like,
so would seated or standing be better?
I think standing with the Jefferson would be a bit more optimal.
Yeah, or just with your body weight.
Yeah, just with your body weight in the standing position. But then, if you're in this sort of like sitting pike, it would be possibly a little bit better whether you're having a plate on the back or something like that. But I feel standing would be the best option.
Yeah, let's try that. Let's try standing. If you could stand and just do your pike stretch.
Somewhat there a little bit.
Yeah, it's a nice pike. So this is a great example of a bodyweight static stretch, because he's using his body weight to move deeper into the stretch. And with his body weight, he's creating an isometric contraction through the length. So he can access that range quite easily. But what is like one of the key things that is going to happen on this stretch for someone who can't access palms of floor?
Start bending the knees.
Yeah, they might start bending the knees because they want to reach further, because they think that that's more important than the position, right?
Mm.
So positioning is more important than the range. And that's the number one thing that we'll have to identify. And everyone's going to do that. They're going to think that I just got to reach further. So I'm going to bend my knees to reach further.
I find that some of my clients, their head tilts up when they're going down. And I also find like the rounding of the upper back, they forget that they need to round to the upper back.
Yeah.
And then they can create more range to the upper back if they focus on that, to be able to get down lower.
Yep, 100%. Yep, so then positioning, so talking about like some of those, that's the thing we want to be thinking about, is like not just looking at a pike stretch as a stretch, but how this stretch is going to carry us over into the next step. So the next step would be Jefferson curl, head to toe, like these other steps. So in order for us to set that person up for success to get there, we need to start coaching those things now when we're doing a pike stretch. One of probably the things that I ensure and make sure doesn't happen with a pike stretch is that they're just hovering. So the hovering isn't going to allow them to make the articulations and the strength connections with the stretch when they can't actually get feedback with the arms and what, like pressing into something. So it's, in my opinion, it's imperative that we try to find a height where the hands can actually come into contact while maintaining the attributes of a straight leg and the positioning of the hips, so that they can then create strength. So in that, and having that thought process where we want more strength than that passive feeling, we want to have the setup in such a way where we can create that. So the hands, if they can't reach the floor with the hands, we should be doing best that we can that they can press on something. So a box, yoga blocks, he's got a dumbbell there that could probably be set upright and be pressed into, like anything, right? Something that can give them feedback. And when they're pressing into something, we can start cueing specifics of Jefferson curl, because then they can get feedback into, like, there's load now into my arms, into my upper body, into my back. And it's going to be easier for them to make those connections with what Bean is talking about with upper back flexion and what they're doing with their head, because now they have feedback and they can actually feel like connecting with something with the hands. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna like kind of jump on the back of that with you bringing up it as a preparatory range, like both as preparatory for other movements you're about to do, and then future like exercises, weeks, months, years down the road. The cueing in those positions I found to be like the biggest like bang for your buck, because it's such like an experience to be in that position for longer than 10, 15, 20 seconds, that like the cueing is where when you cue somebody, that's when they start to find the aspects of the stretch and really hone in on what their body is going through. And sometimes like it only takes like 30 or 40 seconds. But just like that little bit of cueing, it gets them thinking about, okay, what is my body actually doing in this position? And those sorts of things, so that in the future, when you go to something that like in the range sprint, there's like 10-second like static stretches. Whereas if you've never held that stretch for long enough before, maybe you don't like actually get into the stretch and feel the stretch until like the end of the 10 seconds. And now you're like, oh, well, 10 seconds is up. Whereas like if you've done the stretch before and you've done it right and you've been cued, you can get right into the stretch. You get the biggest bang for your buck out of the smaller increment, like intervals.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. What are some...
Sorry.
Go ahead, Nina.
So Michael, what kind of cues would you recommend then?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So we'll talk about cues here. So like, what are cues you're thinking about, Michael?
So when you're talking about pressing the hands into the floor, that'll activate like not only the shoulders to kind of stretch you down further, but also if your hands are in contact with something, you'll find that they're engaging their abdominal muscles to pull themselves in deeper. If you can cue in like the hip flexor, a lot of times like just like trying to reach with the belly button towards the floor is another one, or belly button towards the thighs will get somebody to flex their hips. And so then that'll adjust like the tilt in the pelvis. And then doing the Jefferson, if you move in or out of that stretch by tilting those hips, that's also helpful. And so those are just like a couple of things that I think work really well.
Nice. Most common things that we'll see happen in this stretch are people, again, with stretching in general, people try to move away from the stretch because the stretch sucks. The body is always trying to find a way to get away from it. And that's like, those are the cues that we look for, is like, okay, well, how is this person going to try to get away from this stretch? So the knee bend is one for sure. That's like right away. We should be on top of that. But hip alignment and positioning, that's another big one too. So the hips push back to get away from the full stretch through the hamstrings. So we cue hips. We want to think about hips going over the midfoot. That's a good cue for pike stretch. So if you do that, Riley, you mind demoing that? Like just to show hips behind, like as you reach down, push your hips back towards the mirror, right? And now bring the hips over the midfoot. Keep bringing them over and over and over and straighten your knees more and more. And then we get like a stronger range from that position. Yeah.
Sorry, I've got all the questions today.
That's good.
So I have a client, I think I talked to her last week. She's hypermobile. So I programmed in my normal session for them we tested head to toe pike in the beginning at the end. So we programmed around that. And she found that her knees lock out at the end and she feels like she can touch the floor, but it really locks out and it pushes her back. So that cue, they just talked about the hips going mid part of the foot. Do you think that would help her not to lock her knees out? Or I don't know, like, I feel like because she's hypermobile, I need to be careful.
Mm-hmm.
And
so with someone like that, we got to think less about the joint and more about the tension of the muscles. So like for her, if her knees lock really easily, but her thighs are soft, that would be like what I'm looking for. Because someone who's hypermobile, like I can lock my knees, but I have soft tension. So that's where it would be, okay, her knees are locked, her alignment's good, but where's the tension at in her quads? And oftentimes when you can correct the tension, then sometimes knees will bend because there's a lack of strength, right? So usually someone who's hypermobile like that, you'll start cueing tension and all of a sudden their joints are now bending because there's these hypermobile joints, but they don't have the connections with the muscles. So you'll kind of see like this wobbly kind of thing going on because especially if you cue it, if she gets into her end range and then tries to cue that, it might look messy. Whereas if you can, now like pull her out of it just so you can troubleshoot, because often that's a good way to demonstrate that with someone. You can get them in the end range and they can't cue their quads. Okay, that's a problem. So now I'm going to pull you back, cue your quads, and maybe now she's not as deep, but she's feeling way more tension. She's feeling it the way that we want her to, in such a way where she's restructuring and building strength.
Yeah, so I pulled her out of it. So her knees slightly bent, but she couldn't get her palms down to the ground.
Right.
So based on what you said, it sounds like she lost that tension when her knees are locked out. Yeah,
she has no strength through her end range. So she can't make, agonist activations. That's like the next lesson. Well, and that'll carry over from that too, right? We can take what we learn in agonist activations and bring it to someone like that in those situations and say, like, can you even activate the agonist muscles in these end ranges? Usually that's the case with people who are hypermobile or dancers and things like that. They can't make those connections in the end range. And then we have to build that strength back up kind of from the ground up. So yeah, that's a very common scenario as well with hypermobile people. And that's a good conversation to go back and forth about too, right? Is like where you get people who are restricted and they don't have that access, but then you have people who have the access, but they don't have any strength or awareness of, how they have access to this range. I don't know. I've just always been flexible. I can just touch the ground. Okay. But you're injured all the time. So now we need to like find ways to build strength. So, what if we do the couch stretch? So if Riley does the couch stretch there, and this is a good one because couch stretch is all about threshold. So with pike stretch is pretty easy to control threshold because someone's just folding, and then it's more about coaching. And it's like, okay, I want to coach you on how to fold the way I want you to fold through flexion. And then you want to create tension with blocks. You don't want them hovering. But couch stretch is one of those weird ones because it's like impossible. Like it really is hard to troubleshoot a threshold for someone. So if I want Riley to be below a threshold, like, so say in that position there, he's just like max, he's torqued. I would get him to back out of it. So we would decrease that angle, preferably by moving the knee away. That would be one way to do it. But there should be some measurement of success there. So staying below threshold would be couch stretch. And a lot of these static bodyweight stretches can be prescribed at a higher frequency, which is good for us because then we can give more of a common prescription. It shouldn't be overwhelming, but it should be like specific to the movements that we know are going to progress well and make change. We would probably want to kind of undulate his training in that he has days where he's moving into threshold for sets, and then more frequently he's just below the threshold. But cueing couch stretch, so that's a bit of a different one to troubleshoot as well too. So you can come out of that, Riley. Thank you. So we present that, or I've presented it in two ways in the exercise library. So quad dominant and hip dominant. I just call it 1 and 2. So we can change our positioning to make the effects of the stretch more specific to the hip or more specific to the quad. Right? So have you guys gone through that and a pretty good understanding of that?
Yeah, so making it more for the hip flexor sort of target, it would be obviously posterior tilt of the pelvis, cueing that.
Yeah, I mean, more hip extension.
Hip extension, to stretch the hip flexor. Yeah.
And we just think rather than gluing the butt to wall, we're now moving into extension away from the wall. Yep. So it's good to have those milestones. If we can get the first position down where we get an individual flush to wall and we build nice knee flexion through the quad, then it's going to be easier to progress through hip extension.
So to, like, as a hierarchy, you would want to attain the knee flexion prior to focusing more on the hip extension.
Yep. Because someone who's that bound up and tight, they won't even be able to articulate the hip extension specific one. Because if they're not flush to wall, they're already kind of in a hip extension, but we're trying to teach them to be into the quad and to posterior tilt so that they have more quad and then build that up. So it really save time and energy on yourself as a coach and coaching someone. Just work towards, building that milestone in the first position, getting good knee flexion. And then once they're there, they'll be able to articulate the next step is moving away, like having hip flexion kind of separating from knee flexion.
Yeah, that's real smart. There's also, they get a psychological win out of that as well when they get to that point and use that wall.
Yeah, so then you're setting those targets. Those are like front splits targets.
Yeah.
Which is cool because then it's like now instead of being like, I don't know, we're going to someday get the front splits, like, no, we're going to work on couch stretch. We're going to get couch stretch here and we're going to articulate. Couch stretch comes pretty quick too. That's why it's a good one to work on is that it'll open up quick. It'll come pretty quick for someone. And then it'll have that trickle down effect. Like we talk about now, you go to long lunge and all of a sudden you could train long lunge with someone who's like, fresh and they could understand the position, but not see much progress, but you're making progress in couch stretch. All of a sudden you start seeing long lunge just open up. And it's just getting better and stronger because they have better knee flexion. They're more aware of what's happening. And that's where we have that kind of system where it's like, okay, we're working towards this. So it's okay to introduce this and we can kind of have that trickle down effect, but set those milestones and targets on some of those preparatory range exercises more so than the big ones.
Yeah, that's good.
Have you guys run into common issues or problems with couch stretch?
I have one.
Yeah.
I have a client who's really tight and she around her hip flexors. And when she gets into that couch stretch, she has to put her front knee out to the side. Like she can't align it.
Mm-hmm.
And she says that when she puts it out, it helps her feel better around her hips.
Mm-hmm.
So she's got gluteal tendinopathy as well. So we're just trying to open her up. And she says that she doesn't feel the spot, but I always explain to her that it's how it feels different on everyone. It's not the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
The stretch that we're trying to get.
Yeah, it does feel different. I mean, it feels different side to side too.
Okay.
Like, you'll do your right side and it's just jacked up right away. You're like, holy shit. And then you go to your left side and you're like, I don't feel nothing. Right? But it's the time and the patience in the stretch that's going to make the difference. I would try to really find a way for her to avoid the misalignment there, because it just makes it forward into other, like that would probably be how you would sell that to her. Because if she's like very reluctant to try to find alignment, okay, now you need to sell it to her why she needs to find alignment. It's like, okay, I understand it feels good, but long lunge won't progress where we want it to progress to unless we really try to like work hard for that alignment there, or some of those other movements where you're going to like progress to, right? Like even split squat. Like if you start introducing her to body weight split squats or load specific kind of split squats, it'll be like giving her bad habits before she gets to that kind of point where now we're going to start doing other things. And that would be probably the picture I would try to create for her, is like, if we are going to get to this point, I really need you to try to work on that alignment. That's going to be probably the breaking point for you to get to the next level or to the next step, is if we don't really work on that alignment there.
I think what happened, the reason she said that she puts the leg a bit further away, the front leg, is because she gets pinching in her hips from the front leg.
Okay, so it's the front leg she's moving away.
Yeah, the front
okay.
leg, yeah. So okay. I let her do it and let her focus on the back leg to get that stretching on the hip flexor.
Okay.
And then, over time we'll try and address that to keep the alignment. It's a very slow progress.
Yeah. And how long has that been?
About 3 months now. She's been seeing an osteo also.
That's not bad. And she's seeing progress.
She doesn't feel it. I can see it. So I can see it. The osteo can see it, but she doesn't feel it.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe type of the person that needs that reassurance that you're going in the right direction. It just takes a little bit of time. I used to always use some of those tools with like agonist activations to like jack those people up a little bit in a good way. Like you could use seated pike lifts to just get them. I mean, sometimes those people crave a bit of a harder workout, if that makes sense, but in a way where it's like they feel like they're like working harder because they're bored and they're in this position, and it's like, okay, well, this sucks. I don't like this, and I want to be better. And then just use some of the tools that are actually going to continue to help her and kind of just like jack her up a bit. Like I've done that with a lot of people where it's like, it's like that constant, like, yeah, this is boring and it sucks. It doesn't feel good. And it's like, I'll find a couple movements that feel good and make you feel like you're kind of working your butt off, and kind of give them that feeling they're looking for every once in a while, kind of break the cycle. So, I mean, with couch stretch, we can think, a seated pike lift with a couch stretch. Like that's where the protocol idea kind of can come into play in our favor for when we start dealing with people like that need to break the cycle a little bit. So maybe instead of like these kind of drawn out, boring couch stretch holds, we do a couch stretch, and then we go into a seated pike lift, and then we go into maybe one of the other movements like a tibialis raise. Tibialis raise is a nice one that jacks people up, and it's safe and progressive. And then you create this little circuit, and they're like, oh, this feels wicked, and my tibialises were sore. And you're like, all right, cool. Every third day we'll do that, but then we're going to do the other stuff in between. So yeah, like don't be afraid to be creative with it. And that was when I did put the protocols course out was I tried as best as I could to just kind of be like, there's some rules of thumb, but it's open for interpretation. Like, don't be afraid to like kind of, give people. That was one of the reasons why the range sprint had a big win, was because people were like, oh, it's kind of a hard workout, and I'm just like sweating. It's like I'm stretching, like I'm getting in shape, and I'm getting splits. It's like, okay, yeah, it's like, but there's a deeper meaning behind it when they get out of that excitement a little bit, right? So, use that to your advantage. And that would be like one of those things, those tools you can use is like, and I would do that too quite regularly with clients, is like, we kind of have like conditioning days for flexibility. So it's like you're doing horse squats with maybe some seated straddle lifts with like, you just start like, kind of going through this kind of sweaty circuit of like range of strength stuff. And then you have the other days where you're doing like the longer drawn out stretches and, getting that side of it going as well too. But that's a good strategy. Probably try that out with her and let me know how it goes. Yeah, that'd be good. So maybe that last stretch we could look at is the Y, the body weight static upper body Y stretch. So if you don't mind, Riley, just, you have a nice setup, bro. I appreciate your setup today. But we focus for body weight static stretching. We've focused on the ATY stretch, and just because it is like, it's pretty simple. Like, simple is good. Get someone lying on their stomach with A position is the easiest. T position is intermediate. Y position becomes harder because people are usually more jacked up through the pecs, especially the upper pec. So in the course, the standard coaching certification is a 30-second Y stretch, because the Y stretch is like the harder position. So we're looking to create that Y shape, which what most people will do is they'll probably go into more of an I shape. Like, they'll just go, they don't know why. So they're just there. And they're just like, I can't feel it. I'm like, well, you're just not in a Y. So that's like a really important thing for us to teach, is that Y position. So really looking to retract, externally rotate the shoulders, and then we're using our body weight to increase the load of the stretch. So like, how far can you go on that stretch, Riley?
Ooh.
That feels pretty good.
Yeah, I'm a bit jacked on this side.
He could cross his top leg over to the other side to create more resistance. And he could also reach his arm over to the other side to create more resistance. So manipulating the body to create tension, that's what's one of the beautiful things about those body weight static stretches, is the ATY stretches. But don't be afraid to regress this and use the wall. So if you have someone who cannot figure that out, you can just do it against the wall. But the beauty of this, and this is like a pretty old school stretch, right? Like, really, if you think about it, that's like your standard walk into a gym, you see someone doing that stretch. But we have the power to progress that to something greater. And that's where we would move to the floor and be doing ATYL stretches, looking to open up bicep tendon and the pec, as they tend to be like, the most jacked up areas of the body. So yeah, that was kind of what I wanted to focus on today, guys, was, going over that lesson. And I think I may even, I would like to continue doing this week by week and just like update these lessons in the cert, because there's like things that we can troubleshoot together, which is nice to have live on the cert itself. And there are updates here. It's like, there's just like things that we've been doing as a community, and like seeing you guys integrate the stuff and come up with certain challenges and things. And, I'm now presenting it again with some of the things I've learned from you guys, and some of those challenges that we've come up with. And yeah, that was the main goal today, was to just kind of go through that lesson. And so now, like, opening up just the floor to you guys, how are we making out with the certification itself, like Michael's gone through the whole thing. Specifically this lesson, the static body weight stretching, does that all kind of make sense in those connections and why this is different than static stretching? Like, that's the back and forth I had when we were doing the lessons, was like, do we call this lesson static stretching, or do we just hone in on what's the most important? So it's good to know static stretching, the history of it, the difference, I guess, between some of the passive components of flexibility, which we presented a little more here today, but really static stretching at its lowest level, this would be the most important area for us to focus on. Static body weight stretches where we can now build strength. So we're strength training. We're actually putting someone in a position, holding a position. We're programming that in such a way where, we're building threshold to get to the next step, the loaded range work, the high intensity isometrics, those kind of higher tiered components. So within that, the idea wasn't to bore you with like a really long drawn out thing on static flexibility, but say like, this is like the most important component and what we need to really attack, kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I think this is good, because even myself, I always think, oh yeah, look at the loaded mobility, and this keeps coming up in conversation a lot on either these calls or other sort of platforms, and yourself and Jeff really iterated that, people just forget about the basics a lot, and you can prescribe this to someone to go home with.
Yeah.
That's starting out, and like you said, they might be really well versed at some loaded stuff, more in their lower vicinity of their body, but their upper body around their shoulders, because they just don't really have it yet. They're way more jacked. So on those things, it's just good to like let them go with that without having, and it's just a bit safer. And I think a lot of people just forget about it and start doing the loaded stuff.
Yeah, and they don't make the connections that we are strength training with this stuff when it's done right. And that's like the connections I want you to make with with people like that, is like, this is a form of strength training, and it can be done at a higher frequency. We can address certain structural imbalances that you have, or like major deficits. And yeah, getting to that next level, you'll also have that scenario where someone comes to you and they're like, 90% of the time, people I talk to are just doing weighted mobility. So they say, I just do weighted mobility. It covers all the ends. It covers all the bases. It's like, no, it doesn't. That's why your back's still jacked up. It's like, my back's jacked up, but I just do weighted mobility. It's like, yeah, it's because you haven't stretched and you haven't figured out how to lay down tissue in this, these areas you're having problems with. But, yeah. And again, the other component to it, which Kit drives home really well, is honing in on that parasympathetic nervous system, the ability to rest and relax. That's like a lost thing. Like, people go to yoga for that, right? But maybe they aren't finding that in a way that would like be beneficial towards their current ability, which is a very common thing. Like, I've experienced that, where I'm standing around and no one's helping me, like, but that is one of the keys with flexibility training, is like, as much as it is like we are working towards high intensity training and like working towards like a greater ability in our performance with it, it's like the only training discipline that you can actually hone in on that with. Like, I can't barbell squat and relax, right? Like, I can't go for a run and relax and channel that like system. But when I train flexibility, I can channel in on those recovery systems. I can have meditative kind of sessions, and then I can have higher intensity sessions. And it's like, that's a key thing too, that often people are missing, is like, they're just always jacked up. Their nervous system's just way too jacked up all the time. You haven't actually just relaxed. I don't know how, right? So that's kind of the other key component is like, how do we now do that? Okay, well, we go down to that preparatory work, find that below threshold static bodyweight stretch that's going to work for that person, and get them now channeling into these systems that they've never really channeled in on before. And it becomes less about like their worries and more about like, just chill, man. Just like relax, like everything's going to be all right. So that's a strength in itself too, is being able to coach someone through those things as well. But yeah, it's actually the static bodyweight stretches are probably the most important one of all of them, I would say, for sure. Starting out. Yeah. Cool. What's going on, Coey?
I've just got a question, like taking myself as an example for the couch stretch. So if you do 3 sets and then you're doing 30 seconds and then the threshold kind of decreases as you get into the stretch by the 3rd set. So for the first set, you can't touch your heel with your ass. And then by the 3rd set, you can. And then you have to stick with the 30 seconds. Will there be a situation where maybe, you get too overly confident and then the 3rd set, maybe you want to hold it for a longer time to kind of get more gains out of it?
Yeah. I mean, I would probably now look at what happens when you hold a couple sets of 60, because then within a 60-second set, you might now get deeper, right? So now you're at a point where you're able to identify that you've gotten deeper by the 3rd set. That means we can probably identify how long it takes you to get deeper in 1 set. Right. So that would probably, that would be where you want to go to next, is like, okay, if I now do a set of 60 and it's 2 sets of 60 or 3 sets of 60, maybe after the 1st set, you're there, right? You're at this new range that usually takes you 3 rounds of 30 to get to. And that's how we want to progress down the line, because ideally, if you're just doing with couch stretch 1 set of 2 to 3 minutes to find your range, that's the sweet spot. That's where you want to be. Mm-hmm. So I would do that now, is like, I would just jack up the time on the hold and see if you can just get there longer. And this would be that process of getting to cold range. Like, people are always asking, like, how do I get my cold flexibility better? You measure how long it takes you to get that cold flexibility, and you keep bringing that down, right? So you just identified that, by a minute and a half in a 30-second window, I'm getting this new range. Okay, well, let's do 1 minute sets in couch stretch. You're going to allow the body to have more adaptation. It's going to get into that end range within a minute. Probably you'll see that gain. Then you'll do a set where it's just 2 minutes. You'll get into that range. And then you'll notice that just like, you can just get into that range. Just, you keep it. That's a good way to do it. I've done it that way too, where I time how long it takes me. And that's how I've gotten cold flexibility better. And that's usually what I do with clients, is we're always like evaluating the time it takes to get palms to floor pike. Like, the first time you get palms to floor pike, it's like, okay, what's the next step? Am I going to do like a heavy Jefferson curl? It's like, no, we're going to bring down the time it takes you to get palms to floor pike and introduce Jefferson curl. So we want to be able to set those milestones.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, man. Let me know how that goes. Try the 1 minute, see like if it happens quicker, and then that's the sweet spot. How you going, Antonio?
Doing good. At this stage, just observing a lot. I haven't really worked as a strength coach. I'm more of a jiu-jitsu coach. Okay. So we're still on lockdown in terms of practicing jiu-jitsu. So I'm just using this time to accumulate some knowledge and be prepared. So by the time we open up, we can introduce these range exercises to everyone. I want to get it to a point that, like how Real Movement as a tribe has all of these attributes that we share, like range and then juggling, that for my students, that everyone will be able to do a pike and all the other positions that we're getting into, because it really will help everyone's jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and I am a strength training enthusiast also outside of jiu-jitsu. I was a very active athlete when I was in grade school, high school, and college, and a lot of my success was attributed to doing a lot of strength work, which none of the other athletes at that time was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually everything that we're doing here in Real Movement, I want to integrate it when we finally do get to open our doors, hopefully maybe next year.
Yeah, that'd be awesome, man. And you can see the components of strength now with the flexibility work.
Definitely. Yeah.
So that's a nice place to be in, because maybe you don't feel as restricted to integrating strength.
Yeah. And with the nature of our sport also, a lot of our athletes tend to get injured and they lose a lot of mobility and range.
Yeah.
So, and no one's teaching our athletes how to get those things back.
Yeah.
So, we're going to use the knowledge that we're getting here to help everyone get strong knees, strong shoulders. Those are where everyone's really jacked up in jiu-jitsu.
Nice.
So, even the national team, I'm looking at them, and when they have the strength training sessions, they're always telling their coaches that they can't do the lunges because their knees jacked up. So I want to be able to help these athletes to be able to get the range back on their knees and be able to perform optimally.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, the standards that are laid out in Range of Strength are good standards to get people to work towards as well. So when you guys look at that, because that's one of the things I'm trying to do with those standards is like, maybe to be at a world-class standard of some sort, you need the full splits in all directions and all that stuff. But the standard to demonstrate like the content and to be like in a really good place with flexibility, that's really those standards. Like when you go look at the 2-minute horse stance, the hanging L, like those, like the way it's all laid out, like those are good standards probably to even think about getting your clients to work towards those standards before, going crazy hard on like the splits, so to speak, like, and it gives you those clear targets. So yeah, that's what that standards program is really more mapped out for those milestones. But yeah, we want people to feel like there's realistic targets to hit. And that's where there's like this two-sided, like people will go hard and train for splits too soon, too hard. And then people will do flexibility every day, but make no gains at all because they're just not pushing themselves. Right. So it's kind of like, yeah, it's that double-edged sword, so to speak. So what's up, Luke? Luke trained hard on the gymnastic bodies, flexibility, when I started training it. So, yeah, like he's been through a lot of the rigmarole of like the flexibility work and more of a strength training guy kind of thing. Like, but, yeah, a lot of lessons learned during those times. But cool, guys. Do you guys have anything else to add for this week's lesson? And everyone feels pretty good, pretty solid. Cool. That was nice to review. It's going to be good, I think, to just kind of take our time going through those lessons again as you jump on, and I'll make sure those videos get updated for anyone that missed them and just create some course discussion around it. Cause yeah, some of you are actually doing these things with your clients and some of you are figuring out like, how am I going to do these things? Like best approach, so to speak. So.
Hey, Lucas, just quickly, I was wondering, cheers. Thanks for sending through that, other program through the stuff. Yeah. Cause it's been a week. So, I'm super still my hamstrings. So I was like trying to give that a bit of a break, but I'm going to do all the, because the end of the range sprint, once that's done, you do your baselines again to see the improvement.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, is the program you sent on Train Heroic, is that part of that baseline protocol to now take, or is that just another taster? How do you?
Yeah, that's just the standards program where you're just getting into more of a higher volume kind of approach towards working towards those standards that are laid out in the course.
Awesome.
So, I mean, if you already have the standards, that could be something to do, is just test your standards. And if you hit them, cool. And then you can more or less use the standards program as a way of learning, how do I kind of program someone to maybe work towards those standards kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. I just wanted to clarify that before we go. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, man, you went hard on the sprint.
Yeah, like, again, yeah, it was just, I'll just focus mainly on this. And actually had a bit of, I went and got an MRI done on the shoulder, and it's actually, because I asked about that, and now I'm learning more through the certification, like, oh yeah, that's what's going on. But I actually have like arthritis in one of the joints, so it was like something completely different, but it's good learning this. So I'm gonna hopefully mitigate any more stuff going on with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going to be, I'm glad I'm learning this part to help me out. So it came at the right time.
Yeah, I'm really excited to, my plan for season 4 is to do a program called Old Time Range of Strength. And it's going to have like the old time lifts I've been playing with in there. But man, I have issues on my left shoulder. Like I've always had issues there. That's the side I had operated on and stuff. And that's side press. Dude, that is like next level. Yeah, next level learning in like the shoulder and trunk and like connecting them together. And it's just one of those weird things, like my right can do it, and it's like my left, I had to spend like 3 weeks trying to like get my brain to connect with the movement on my left side. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to bring some of those things to you guys and see how you guys fan out with it. And
hey, Lucas, how's it going, man?
Hey, man.
Sorry to interrupt you, Riley.
That's all good.
Yeah, I had a problem with my mic, but things are going pretty well, except with my ankles.
Yeah.
I stepped in a hole with the one ankle, and then got something dropped on my ankle on the other side. So, and it just kind of flares up when I back squat, but I can do everything else.
Interesting.
So yeah, I've never had an injury like that before. You know, when I do one movement and it just flares up again. So
yeah. I was going to say like, one thing like I've looked at too, cause I do get, my ankle does get jacked up on my right side. Just, I guess, old injuries from growing up and stuff. And what I've done on that side that's helped really well for me is a lot of fascial release work on my tibialis on that side. So it's kind of weird how my ankle will get blocked and jacked. But and it almost feels like it's because my tibialis is jacked. It's like jacked up. So I've helped a few people with some ankle and knee symptoms with squatting and addressing that. And it seems to be like you could stretch the tibialis, rotate it. Like there's a lot of stuff you could do for it. But if you're not getting like the fascial release in on it, I find it just gives it that next level kind of addressing or whatever. Like that's what I've been doing, and I've been helping quite a few people with that. So when you did say that, I was thinking about it, and I was like, the first thing that came to mind was like, you know, are you getting some massage working on the tibialis? It's like such a weird thing to say. Yeah. but yeah, like usually what happens is if you've had an injury in the knee and ankle, your tibialis is always jacked up because it's trying to prevent the the ankle and knee from doing things that it doesn't want to do. So it ends up just being jacked up all the time. Sort of like sciatica, kind of like the muscles just contracting all the time to avoid the movement. So maybe I would experiment with that this week, man. Like,
yeah, I'll give that a try.
Yeah, it's not usually an area that people address either. Is like, I know Ben's been teaching strengthening your tibialis, which does work really well too. But often if you've had an injury there, and it gets swollen or jacked up, like in the knee or ankle, it does require a lot of release work in the tibialis to prevent it from getting swollen and blocked.
Yeah, man, I think I'll give that a try this week.
Yeah, I do.
Tibialis release.
Yeah.
And cool. Actually, like Antonio, I also do jiu-jitsu as a hobby. And I think all of the range of strength stuff is going to be amazing for jiu-jitsu, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It could probably be like a primary strength.
Yep.
Yeah.
Hey, Lucas, just out of curiosity as well, did you obviously see all the FRC stuff and things like that? Have you had much to do with that, or?
Not at all. I'm gonna take a look at it as soon as possible.
The FRC stuff?
Yeah, the FRC stuff. Have you?
Yeah, I've gone through the course content. A friend that took the course shared it with me, and then I did some sessions with some FRC certified coaches, and yeah, it was pretty straightforward. Like once I understood everything, I was like, okay, I'm not going to spend 2 hours doing these protocols. There's a lot of good stuff there, and I mean, it's really just about like next level articulation of movement, like but without like weight. I think it's hard for people to get to that kind of level of articulation without external resistance. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. I mean, like when I was trying to get my shoulder checked out, because it's been ongoing 6 years, I was working with a physio who, he was just like working a lot with the irritation of like, the gripping, these types of concepts and things like that. But I felt that it's like, I don't know. I just couldn't, at that time, I just couldn't sort of understand the idea behind it and that sort of stuff. Whereas like, I feel range, it's like, okay, you're actively, you're stretching here, you're getting into this position. It's a bit more, it's a bit better for my brain to understand that.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any, like what you think about just what your opinion would be on it. But obviously, it makes sense.
Yeah, the time under tension call that we did, were you on that one?
Time under tension. I think it might have been.
It's in Real Movement Live course, but I did the range support call, and it's all on discussing the time under tension methods for flexibility, and we talked about the FRC ones. It's one of them, and it's like the ramping, irradiation, contractions. They're good. There's a time and place for them, but they've been around. Those contractions have been around for a long time. Thomas Kerr's, his isometric contractions, he has 4 different ones that he always used that are very similar, but maybe not to that extent. I've played with them, but I've just found better ways of doing things.
Yeah, there's many ways to skin the cat, right? So,
yeah. Like and even doing this course, the combination of static bodyweight stretches and agonist activations is like a superset.
Yeah.
It's just kind of always been like a bread and butter. Works really well for, rehabbing and creating those end range strengths that we kind of need to start doing. If we can't shoulder press or whatever, we can Y stretch and Y lift and create those contractions in different ways. And then the whole inner range concept that Keegan brings to the table really well is like, that's a huge missing component in a lot of these systems too, like inner range strength, which Ben does really well in knee ability, but that can be applied to shoulders, pecs, biceps. So I think that's like the missing link with a lot of these rehab protocols, is that the inner range prescription should be at a much higher level. So
yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, man.
All right, thanks for that. I'm gonna bounce. Thanks everyone. Good chat.
Yeah, like we'll do the agonist activations next week, and if anything comes up in between, you guys just reach out to me on the workplace and we'll figure it out.